Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Gil Cohen. He has been one of my biggest allies and has over 20 years of experience advising executive teams and HR professionals in their execution of great cultures through behavior and values articulation and implementation. With Gil's experience and his passion for making the world a better place to be in and to work in, I'm excited to have him share his experience with you. Well, welcome, Gil. Can you tell us a little bit about how you discovered your passion or your niche?
Okay. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind introduction. For the first 16 years of my career, and where I learned a lot of what I do and what I know, I worked in a small boutique consulting firm that helps a lot of what you talked about, behavioralization, articulating values, articulating vision, implementing a lot of different talent management projects, succession planning, competencies, behavioral interviewing, all those kind of things. One of the things that process was key in driving my passion was this, is that for most of those projects, we would do focus groups for broad employee population, depending on how many we needed, and then individual interviews with executives other than working broadly, like with the team on the executive team. And over time, it startled me the disconnect between the realities, the disconnect between what executives think is happening versus what's actually happening with the employees on the front lines, the ones who deal with clients, the ones who deal with customers, the ones who do the work that gets everything done. And it was distressing, I'll say, to see that disconnect, because you talk to these executives, and if you were to believe everything they said, they tell you that, everything's pretty sunshine, and they talk about their frustrations, but they would think that the employee experience, not that they would use that terminology, but the experience that their employees were having was pretty good. And quite frankly, they, especially the CEO, but other executives as well, would often believe that the culture was whatever the HR person told them it was. They didn't have a hands-on understanding of what the actual culture is. They have a belief that this is what the HR person tells them it is, so therefore that's our culture. But when you actually talk to the people and give them a safe space to share with candor, you find out that it's not as sunshine and roses as the executives believe. So I sat in many, many focus groups with very frustrated employees. And the thing about that, and this also ties into finding, my niche around employee experience, is that one of the things that stuck with me many years ago in school was that I had a prof that laid out in their syllabus, we spend 40 hours a week at work, 50 weeks a year at work, 45 years working, and that's conservatively, because many jobs don't only have 40 hours a week. I believe it was something upwards of almost 100,000 hours in our lives. So we spend that many hours of our life at work, and here are all of these people, the masses, the most people, high percent of the population, who are frustrated. You look at the Gallup poll every year, and I think they're at an all-time high of 35% of the workforce is engaged. That's a high. 35% is a high, right? And so that's what I carried with me, is that there are all of these people that are frustrated, that their environments can be designed in a different way, in a way that not only leaves them more satisfied and happier at the end of the day, but actually leaves them more productive. That's one of the other elements about it. Of what always struck me is that many leaders succeed despite themselves and despite their decisions. So they make decisions that make people less productive, But because the company is able to maintain productivity, profitability, they're ignoring the opportunity cost of what's lost when they upset people or when they handle a layoff poorly, causing everybody who remains to be dissatisfied, to be disengaged. So all of their intent doesn't actually come out in the end because they don't apply it through people, they apply it through their own lens of what they think it should be, which then ties into why I care so much about employee experience, because traditionally that's what leaders do. They make a decision, everybody else has to execute it. Unfortunately, that ignores the fact that they're human beings. We're not just robots, we're not just a program, a computer program that you program it in and expect it to do it that way. I assume programmers are laughing at me when I say that you program it a certain way and they expect it to actually work that way. But that's not actually how it works. And so they need to understand that the employee perspective and the employee lens determines how well their plans get executed. And if they ignore those things, their message is going to be lost because people will hear what they hear, not just what leaders want them to hear.
There's so much to unpack there because when you talked about just the disconnect between what is communicated to the executive leadership team versus what is actually being experienced on the front line, like that's one part of it, that I'm like, okay, like at what point in time does that disconnect gap widen and widen, and why from an organization perspective that becomes less of a priority, despite the fact that it does give you a competitive edge when you are able to engage some of those perspectives, whether it's solving complex business problems or even from the perspective of, well, if you're not going to hear me out, I'm going to walk out the door and go somewhere else where someone is willing to walk me out. So based on your consulting experience, like what has been one of the biggest epiphanies to date that has caused that widening gap?
Okay, so that widening gap, unfortunately, is a fundamental reality of two things. The paradigm in which we build organizations and the hierarchical, for lack of a better term, patriarchal structure with which we build organizations, and the psychology of power. Because what happens is that at every level, information gets filtered. The frontline staff only let their supervisor, team leader, manager know so much because they're trying to protect their jobs, as everybody then is up the line. That manager, team leader, supervisor is trying to protect their job and make themselves look good in front of the director. Most organizations do not have the safety to make mistakes. So when the errors, the bad things happen, those ideas and issues get filtered because people are scared to share them or just have been trained not to, not necessarily within that company, just by society of, look, if I tell them I made this mistake, I'm risking my job. I need to keep my job. It's just a natural thing. And so because of the way we build our hierarchical organizations, that each level has ever growing power over those below them, what happens is that people aren't comfortable sharing with their leaders, not because of the nature of the person, but because of human nature. And that's, to get into a little bit of an aside, that's also one of the mistakes that leaders make, is they think people behaving a certain way is a sign of that person's behavior, not a sign of the environment they've created. But that's what happens, is the environment ends up being created in a way where information doesn't naturally flow upward, especially information of certain kinds. So there was a study done, I think in the 1980s, about they ended up terming it the iceberg of ignorance. And in that study, they determined, I don't believe these numbers are true for everybody, but they determined that of the organizational issues, 100% of them were known by frontline staff, and fewer up to executives who knew, I think, 4%. of organizational issues. And this is within that organization. Unfortunately, you'll see that chart many times on social media as if it's some sort of meaningful number. It's not, but the concept is meaningful. The number of CEOs I've spoken to, especially first-time CEOs, who are shocked at the change in the way people treat them and the change in the information they're provided. Because people want to make their area sound better. They don't want, they don't want to share, I'm having struggles. This is the difficulty we're having. Because of the fear of what might happen. A great thing I was taught many years ago is that behavior is a function of expected consequences. So that means that we behave based on what we expect the outcome to be from that behavior. Well, organizational culture teaches that very well of what expected consequences should be. One of my favorite examples I use of leaders that will often say, "Oh, I have an open door policy. You can come to me with anything." The problem is when people come to them, they either, ream them out for complaining, or they don't want to hear it all, or they complain about somebody else having complained, all behaviors that discourage the person from coming back. And so you can say and put it in your policy all you want that I have an open door policy. But if your behavior discourages that, you're limiting the information that you're actually going to receive. And so that is something that is broadly, like I said, just human nature in the nature of how we build our organizations. One of the things I noticed early in my career as a consultant, I was probably maybe 6 months, 8 months into my job as a consultant, which mostly entailed cleaning offices and taking notes. But one of the things I learned early on that I believed was that the person who knows the least of what's actually happening in the organization is the CEO. And many CEOs will balk at that suggestion, but when you actually dive into it and find out what's actually happening, they don't. They don't. Because their team carries an aura around them that makes it difficult for people to share. And that's not even to mention the history of what has happened in that organization, right? How many times have organizations put out employee surveys, ignored it completely, done nothing with it, and then wonder why nobody wants to respond to the employee survey? So there's also that history of people learn, again, expected consequences. If I fill out this form, they're going to ignore it and do what they do anyway. Why would I fill out the survey? What's the purpose of filling out the survey? And certainly, why would I make the effort to fill it out sincerely and with full candor? Because they're just going to ignore my opinion, which even further disengages the individual. I've actually spoken to prospects before who, because one of the things I have done with companies is surveys and do with them. But I've spoken to prospects before that I'm very clear that if they're not going to take direct action based on what employees have said, I don't want to do the survey with them because it actually makes things worse. It actually makes things worse because they're increasing or decreasing their credibility. They're increasing the lack of trust because they're showing, we're going to ask you and we're not even going to do anything about it. We're not going to change our behavior because we're not actually listening. And so that's why voice of employee, building that feedback loop, that genuine feedback loop, so that executives can make effective decisions. That's one of the other things I always find interesting about, employee experience, HR in general, is that executives make assumptions and believe they know it without the actual data. And I don't just mean the numbers that the HR team collects. I mean the actual data, the qualitative data of how people respond. What are people's expectations? What is people's history? All of that. But they make these decisions without all of that. They make these decisions in a vacuum of this is where we think the company should go. We're going to point in that direction and everybody's got to go there. And then wonder why a high percentage of change management initiatives fail.
As I'm listening to you talk about that, I think very deeply about one is the execution of a lot of these strategies that are put out there aren't sustainable because there's almost like a misalignment between what was originally intended to be the culture, right, and the values that they wanted to ultimately execute on. And then as things become more bureaucratic and complex, the behaviors, I think, make it like it's not in alignment because it's just like I have so much crap on my plate that I can't even begin to think about like how do I keep that alignment is I think is the most unprofessional way of saying it, right? So from your perspective, um how do you actually create sustainable behavioral changes from a employee experience perspective? Because like you said, it's like there are more inconsistencies than there are consistencies from a culture perspective, right?
Yes. Okay. I want to start back with the first thing you said about values. I may have to ask you to rephrase the question again, but I want to talk with you about values because if a person finds themselves in a situation where they're faced with either do the things that need to get done or live up to the values that are articulated, it means you articulated the wrong values. That's one of the things because when an organization articulates its values, one of the mistakes that I've seen through my entire career, because that's one thing I've been doing is helping companies articulate values, is that they articulate aspirational values. They articulate the values they think they should have. And I've sat in, I don't know how many executive team meetings where leaders say, well, we're in this industry, we should have this, or people are expecting this, or shareholders are expecting this, or clients are expecting this. But here's the reality. None of that matters if it's not actually aligned to how you're going to behave. The reason why values are become powerful and meaningful is that they need to be grounded in what people actually believe so that when times get tough, that's how they're going to behave anyway. That's when you know a value is a value. So when a leader goes up there and articulates the values and writes values that they think they're supposed to be, and not this is what I firmly believe, this is what's already in my heart, or at the center of the Venn diagram among the executive team, they're not going to live up with that to that. They're not going to live up to that. And you asked about consistency of behavior. Well, that's the root of it. Executives model the behavior that other people will then live up to. Executives model the behavior and demonstrate this is what we actually value. There's a concept around values, there's around overt versus covert values. So overt values are these are the ones we wrote on the wall. Covert values are these are the ones you need to live by if you want to thrive here. And when those aren't actually one and the same, then you have a misalignment where your culture is working against your values. Your values then are going to be looked at with contempt. They're going to be discredited and not used effectively. I imagine that's why a lot of people don't understand the power of values because most companies live like that. Most companies aren't truly values based where they live up to whatever they've articulated. It's a sometimes thing. It's a we're trying to be that thing, not this is who we are and this is how we live every day. You also mentioned behaviors. That's one of the key differentiators around values is that you need to articulate your values behaviorally. Values, what often happens is they state these terms or phrases, they may even have a couple of sentences that are still left completely subjectively up to the person's opinion. And so, how can you have consistency when we have a value of respect that everybody around the table is defining it differently? That's respect is often my favorite example that I use around values, because respect is, depending on the organization, will mean different things. The example I often use is this: you're an employee, your boss comes to you and tells you this is what you should be doing and this is why. You know, for one reason or another, that's a bad idea. You know, whether it's against the values, you've done it before, you have information they don't have, whatever it is, you know that it's a bad idea. Respect to thrive at one organization means saying, you know what, I think that's a bad idea, and I'll explain to you respectfully why. Here's the information I have. Let's have a conversation about it. Respect at another organization, I do it. Both of those companies can legitimately claim respect as a value, and I don't want to discredit that at all, because the reality is that in order to make it consistent, clear, and repeatable, you need to have everybody know exactly what you mean when you talk about respect. It means these behaviors, right? It means that we listen to the subject matter expert, not the person who's got the highest paid around the table, right? Or in our company, we listened to hierarchy. They're your boss. We listen. That's how it is. We can't have questioning for whatever reason. I'm not here to question what makes some companies successful. But you need to have those behaviors, because then once you have those behaviors, that allows you to operationalize consistency. You're then able to implement it into, we're only going to hire people who demonstrate these behaviors already. So we'll use behavioral interviewing, our values as a target, and make sure that only people who are already living up to the behaviors are those we're going to bring on board. That way we don't have to convince them, and that way the people we bring on board aren't going to drive everybody else nuts. So then also performance management, succession, promotions, all of those different things, you can make sure that if you're not living up to these values, you can't be high potential. You shouldn't be promoted into a management position, because that's one of the difficulties, is that somebody does a great job, not necessarily according to the values. They think they deserve reward. They get promoted. Everybody else sees that and they see, oh, this is what it takes to be successful in this organization.
So, with the business landscape being so complex and the increasing need for businesses to be like agile, right? Just because of how quickly things are changing, how frequently should businesses be revisiting these values or behaviors? Like, what does that even look like? Like, do you put in like a quarterly check in and be like, hey, are we still in alignment? Or what does that look like with the work that you do?
It should not be very often, because values are those things. So values, by the because again, definition clarity is important. By the definition that I use, values are strongly held beliefs that are emotionally charged and resistant to change. Values are those things that don't change without significant emotional events. That's the thing about them, is you stick with them. These are the things that, without a major life event, and we could talk about how COVID was that for a lot of people and could be that changing for people, but without a major life event, the values aren't going to change. That it's maybe over extended periods of time, but the reality is that if you look at the values of how people behave, they last for decades. GE is the company that it is today because Thomas Edison was the leader he was 140, 150 years ago. These things don't easily change. There are things that, of course, in specific events, you have a complete turnover of executive leadership. You have new ownership. Certain things, certainly, but generally speaking, it should not be. As well, one of the less understood and not well tapped elements of a well executed values behavior system is that it actually increases the ability for agility. Because what happens is when people are able to make decisions at the right level, they know as long as I'm in these curbstones, I can make that decision, which means that I don't have to go to my boss. My boss doesn't have to go to their boss. I know the right decision to make because my boss has provided me clarity. That's one of the things that pretty much every organization I've spoken to has stated as a goal, but some of them are better than others, is about pushing authority down to the right level, right? If somebody is in front of a client, they know the most about the client. So we need to give them the most autonomy and the most authority to be able, they can't do everything because they don't have the scale or the view that necessarily other levels of the organization have. But without a clarity, they don't necessarily know, is this the right direction? Is this the right behavior? But when you have the curbstones, you know, as long as I behave in this way, I'm going in the right direction and I don't need to check up on it as much. So it actually allows for a greater agility because it allows for decisions to be made at the right level as opposed to everybody else having to check with their boss. Is this the right thing? Is this the right thing? Because as I mentioned before, one of the elements of employee experience is people want to protect their jobs. We're self-protective of our jobs one way or another. We just are, whether that's be filtering what we say to our boss, whether that be, trying to, for many of us trying to do our best or at least look like we're doing our best. We want to do that. And that's just part of our nature.
I appreciate you sharing that from both the agility perspective, but also the fact that GE, right? Like you gave that great example, like where they are at today is because of the values and whoever spearheaded it. But I think that also impacts why it takes forever for some cultures to change, is because a lot of the behaviors are rooted in some of the ways of thinking that are a little bit more deep rooted and they can't change it, right? So from an inclusion and diversity perspective, right? Because we all hear like that gives companies a competitive edge. What would you say is one of the things that is stopping some of these companies from creating that inclusive culture from a values and behavioral perspective? Because they might say one thing, but again, it's not aligning, right?
Absolutely. So you made a great point about this is part of why it's so hard for companies to make change. Because one, trying to change your values, it's not impossible, but it takes an incredible amount of effort and focus that most teams don't put into it because they don't understand they need to talk about it and be about it constantly for it to actually change. They can't just treat it like any other change management project and hope it happens. Um, but one of the other things is one of my favorite stories about company culture, and it comes from a study that was done a number of years ago. Although, if you were to believe the internet, the study was just a myth. But here's the study of five gorillas in a cage. They had five gorillas in a cage, and they had scientists on the outside of it. In the cage, they had a ladder, and at the top of the ladder, a banana. You've got five gorillas, a ladder, and a banana. Obviously, they're going to go for it. However, every time they went for the banana, the scientists would spray them down with cold water. They'd spray them all down with cold water. So eventually they learned, don't go after the banana. Simple as that. Well, then what they would do is they would change one of the gorillas. So they would take out one of the first five and put in a new gorilla. New gorilla, obviously not indoctrinated into the culture yet, doesn't know what's going on, goes to the banana. Goes to the banana. The other four gorillas, as they make a move to the ladder, know if they go, behavior is a function of expected consequences. They know if they allow this gorilla to go to the ladder and get the banana, they're all getting sprayed with water. So they all stop them from going for the banana. Now they do it again. So they replace one of the other original gorillas with a new one. Now this new one goes, three original plus one replacement now tackle this gorilla. So it's not just the originals, but it's also the replacement has learned the behavior. Here, when somebody goes for that ladder, we tackle them. One by one, you replace all of the gorillas with 5 new gorillas. You now will have a new one come in, go for the banana, and you'll have 4 gorillas attack it who have never experienced and actually don't even know why they're stopping them. They only know, here, we stop them. So they have no idea the cause, the reason behind the behavior. They just get indoctrinated into the behavior, and it actually takes 2 full cycles of replacing gorillas for them to actually be allowed to go for the banana again. It becomes that ingrained into their thinking without ever having seen it, without ever having experienced it. They just become part of that culture. But that's what organizations do, is they teach us how to behave, and we don't always know why we're behaving that way. But we know that based on what we see, which is what creates the microcultures and the inconsistency within cultures, because it's, well, in this area, we've learned to behave this way. In this area, we've learned to behave that way. And we interpret whatever the values are up there differently. And we don't actually have to live them because nobody holds us accountable to them. That's what creates that consistency. Whereas, consistency and clarity and predictability is a competitive advantage.
Now I understand why some cultures that have that consistent Kool-Aid that is being drank across all areas is so successful, because it's like there's no different flavor of Kool-Aid for us to consume at this point, right? Like everyone has clarity around what it should taste and feel like. And what I'm hearing also is that if you actually want true lasting change, sometimes it takes a whole new leadership, unfortunately, right? Like it's just based on what I've experienced in one of the organizations that I worked with. It takes a brand new leadership and then continuously drilling into each level of leadership, right? And then the day-to-days and the one-on-ones, like what does that look like, right?
Yeah.
So
And I mean, to your point though, is that, that consistency does not take away necessarily from diversity. That it grounds you, but as long as you're in that value set, there's room for diversity. A great example of that, in my opinion, is McDonald's. You walk into any McDonald's around the world, you get the same vibe. You get that same feeling, but you don't get the same menu. You get a very different menu based on where you are, because they provide the room for, we have these curbstones, but within these curbstones we serve the customer. We make sure that we have foods that meet the customer needs. I've been to a kosher McDonald's before. They will adjust to meet the customer needs, all while very much remaining McDonald's in every location. And so, you mentioned about inclusion. One of the difficulties, in my opinion, the biggest, broadest difficulty, is the paradigm in which organizations are built. That's what broadly holds us back. That hierarchical, patriarchal idea of those at the top know best, and everybody on down is slightly less important and slightly less powerful than the person at the top. The people at the top know best, and the people at the bottom just are told what to do. And that still permeates throughout the business world. It comes from a lot from my experience in reading, from a lot from especially the second industrial revolution, as larger organizations were built, because there weren't many examples to go from, because the only 2 large organizations prior to the industrial revolutions were military and clergy. And those obviously were structured very differently than companies. A lot was taken from the military in particular. But the reality is, even the world in which they built and the work they did back then is very different than what we did now. The number of high school, let alone college graduates 100 years ago. The work they did was easily repeatable and not nearly as complex. So now you have work that is much more complex, much more interdependent with one another, and you have a employee population that is significantly more sophisticated, skilled, and educated than they were 100 years ago, but we're putting them in the same environment. We're still, deciding things for employees. We're still, putting them in these structures where it's built for the opposite of individuality. It's built for us all being the same and we're all replaceable parts, right? Within this bigger machine, we're all replaceable parts. Who cares about a part's individuality? Put in another part. And that's how a lot of leaders, even today, still treat their employees of, oh, that person is a troublemaker, or that person isn't working the way we want them to. They're the problem, without recognizing that maybe it's something else that's going on. Maybe it's the environment, maybe it's their manager, but the manager, again, because they're protecting their job, is only going to share things that sound good for them. They're not going to say, yeah, I'm managing them terribly. I'm just not giving them any clarity. We have no one-on-ones. Like, they're not going to come out and say that. They're only going to say the things generally that make themselves look better and that make the employee the one in the wrong, because it's them or me. So, because that's the way it is. If somebody's not doing well, somebody's got to go out the door.
And as you share that, I have a lot of empathy for people, especially when they've put in a lot of time in an organization, whatever, and they're worried about their jobs. But at the same time, I really hope that they can have a more wide angle perspective, that it's like, listen, we're all here for making this company thrive, right? Like, because if we don't understand that, we wouldn't have a job, right? But for that to happen, you also have to invest into the individual. So as we slowly wrap up our conversation, what would you say is the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to what it takes to unleash an individual or an organization's potential?
Start with listening. That's really, I mean, it might be a little bit more difficult for a lot of people, but I would have said start with empathy, but I'll start with listening. I'll start with, because if you don't actually understand the person and don't understand what they're facing, why they're making the decisions they do, what we end up doing, and again, this goes back to this paradigm issue, is we treat them like a resource. We treat them, they're an entity to take an input to an output. When as human beings, we're more complex than that, and we can't just be treated that way. But that's often how employees are treated. And by many managers, they're treated that their only motivator is money. Their only motivator is money. If I give them some more money, if I'm worried about them leaving, they'll stick around. Right. And that demeans human beings into all being the same in your mind as a leader, as opposed to listening to what makes people individual, listening to what makes them human, because then that will give you the information on which to make better decisions. If you're making decisions based on information about people that you don't understand well, it doesn't lend itself to good decision making. And that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is make the right decisions by people. But if you don't know them, if you just know the work and what you're trying to get accomplished, not the people who are achieving it, you'll never be able to treat them like individuals and never help them thrive. You'll just be lucky if you do, because somebody happens to fit your leadership style, not because you did anything well.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. And one last question for you is, what is one thing you're working on that you are excited about?
I've got a few different things that I'm working on right now. My word for 2024 is partnerships. So I have a few different partnerships that I am working on. The one that's probably closest to fruition is I'm working with I mentioned I worked for a small firm that was actually a family business. I worked for my father for 16 years, who is an absolutely brilliant practitioner. He and I are partnering on a team contracting workshop for teams that to help them become more effective in achieving their objectives. It's something I'm really excited about. It's a bit of a culmination of the work he and I have done in just partnering and putting that together, and I'm really excited to get that out there.
Well, I'm excited to keep in touch with you on LinkedIn and see what that's going to look like. And I'll make sure that your LinkedIn profile and everything is included as well, just so that people can stay up to date. Well, Gil, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge, some tips, and your overall experience. And to everyone else who's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll ever know. And I can't wait to stay in touch with you on our next episode. Till then, stay safe.